Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Chemistry on the Fly with Mr. F. Today we're going to be talking about the chemistry of carbs. Let's do a little bit of review. There's three types of foods and drink that we have. The first one is carbohydrates or just carbs. The second one is proteins, and the last one is fats or lipids. Again, today we're going to be focusing on carbohydrates. So let's do a little review. Some of the foods that count as carbs include breads and pastas and grains and cereals, potatoes, corn, fruit, sweets, and pop. Now, today we'll also realize that even vegetables, the good stuff, have carbs in them. Not a bad thing. Types of carbs that we're going to talk about are going to be, actually, saccharides is kind of just a fancy name for sugars, but we'll talk about sugars in general, and then we'll talk about starches and fibers. Now, the role of a carb is to provide energy. That is the main purpose of the carbs in our diet. Now, we'll find out that carbs actually turn into glucose. Now, glucose is a simple sugar, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it turns out that not just carbs turn into glucose, but just about everything turns into glucose at some way. Not all proteins, but some proteins and even some fats will turn into glucose so our body can use them. And some of the activities that we have are just physical activity, brain function, and operation of all of our muscles and organs. We learned last time that the potential energy for carbs is 4 calories per gram. We're going to take a little bit of a sidestep here and figure out where does glucose or carbs even come from? So we're going to look at a bigger picture. So the first thing we're going to talk about is some of the chemical reactions. The first one is going to be photosynthesis, and this occurs in plant cells, chloroplasts. Now, we learned before that the sun gives off light, and then whatever we see is what's reflected. So that means, and this is something that I didn't quite understand until kind of recently, I've always thought that plants needed green light, but no, it's not actually what they need. They need the other light. Now, when I look at the photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast, there's a chemical in the chloroplast called chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll takes that and turns it into energy. And it turns out, if we look at the absorption spectrum of chlorophyll A, now there's several varieties of chlorophyll, but this particular variety of chlorophyll has an absorption spectrum. So this is what's saying that these are the colors that chlorophyll A absorbs and actually uses. And you can see by the chart that we have chlorophyll A uses a whole bunch of reds and oranges, and then as we get closer to the greens, it gets less and less. So a little bit of yellows, hardly any greens, no blues, but then when we get into the violet, and it gets a whole lot higher again. So chlorophyll A uses a whole bunch of reds and oranges and a lot of violet. That was something that I didn't know before. So let's look at the chemical reaction of photosynthesis. So we have energy, and the energy for us is going to be in the form of sunlight. And then we have 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. And we're going to yield this molecule called glucose. And you can see that it's very complex. Plus, also what we'll yield is 6 oxygens. So there's our 6 oxygens. Now, we said that if we look at the word photosynthesis, we might want to think, well, what does that mean? Well, photo is going to be light, and then synthesis means combining simple things to making something more complex. So if we're taking light energy and carbon dioxide and water, both pretty simple molecules, and turning them into something very, very complex as a glucose molecule. And this is a formula that we'll hear quite a bit today, is C6H12O6, and then some oxygens. Now, if we look at the reaction itself, we can see that plants take in carbon dioxide and water and create glucose and oxygen. Now, I'm not a huge fan of global warming or climate change or whatever you want to call it. And people say that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. I believe that it is, but to me, carbon dioxide is just plant food. So plants need the carbon dioxide to actually perform photosynthesis, and they're doing us a huge favor in doing that. So I'm not a big fan of the global warming theory. Um, Basically because I think we've had this kind of weather changes throughout the history of the world, and not necessarily that the generation of carbon dioxide is the cause of any changes in weather. I think that's just we call it weather because it's unpredictable. So that's just my off on a little tangent there. But it would be nice if we look at the equation again, and it would be nice if I could just take a glass of water, go outside in the nice sunshine, which we don't see all that much in Pittsburgh, but when we get there, when we see the sun, and I can breathe on it, okay, because I exhale carbon dioxide, it would be nice if I could just do that, take a glass of water, go outside and breathe on it and create glucose and oxygen. That would be an awesome thing if that could happen. But the process, this is a big picture process or equation, and the actual process is really, really complicated. And if we look at this picture here, and I'm making this not even that sharp because I'm not expecting you to understand it or use it right now, but next year in biology, we'll have to, and I'm going to let the biology teachers pick up on this. But there's actually 6 stages that allow photosynthesis to happen in the chloroplast. And again, that's a biology subject that you'll pick up later. So let's look at the opposite of photosynthesis. It's called cell respiration. And what happens there? Well, cell respiration occurs in a cell's mitochondria. Now, these are little organelles, is what they're called, in our cells that basically help convert that sugar, that glucose, into energy for our bodies that we use. A lot of times people will say that the mitochondria is the cell's powerhouse. And then this is something that I didn't know exactly as well, is that both plant cells and animal cells have mitochondria because plants need to grow as well as do animals. So they need energy and um, ability to grow. So that's what the and to move and all that stuff. So plants and animal cells both have mitochondria. So let's look at the equation. Now this is going to look really similar because it's pretty much the opposite of what we just saw with photosynthesis, is that we take a glucose and we take 6 oxygens and we yield them into 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. And in our case, or in cell respiration's case, we create something called ATP. Actually, not exactly ATP. We create the energy, and ATP stores that energy for us so we can use it later. We talked a little bit about ATP. It stands for adenosine triphosphate, and that is a storehouse for our energy, for our cells, so that holds all the energy for us so that we can use it when we need to. So this is kind of the opposite, or is the opposite, of photosynthesis. Now I want you to look at what type of reaction this is. Now, if we look closely, this actually looks a whole lot like a combustion reaction, which we have a fuel, which would be our glucose. We have oxygen, free oxygen. We need 6 of those. And I create carbon dioxide and water. Now that's exactly the formula that we talked about for a combustion reaction. So in the big picture, we have little combustion reactions going on in our body. Nah, maybe, maybe not. Just like photosynthesis, cell respiration is not quite as easy as it sounds. There is actually 3 major processes going on in cell respiration that happen in and around the mitochondria. The first one is called glycolysis, which then leads to the Krebs cycle. and which then leads to the electron transport chain. Now, all three of these put together generate a whole bunch of ATPs, and you'll learn about how to figure out how many ATPs next year in biology class. But again, much more complex than just breaking down of glucose and oxygen into carbon dioxide and water. So there's a huge process that goes on there. All right, so let's get away from that. And we talked about glucose, so we're going to look at some sugars. And we're going to call these monosaccharides. And these are going to be simple sugars. These are all carbs that we're going to talk about today. And the first one we're going to call is alpha glucose. The next one we're going to call is beta glucose. And the last one is galactose. Now, these are all forms of glucose. And sometimes I'll just use the word glucose. And most of the time, it's actually going to refer to alpha glucose. But there are some other types of glucose that they have there. Now, a couple things that we're going to notice about these. Now, this is some of the monosaccharides. There's other ones we'll talk about in the next slide. But let's look at some things that we have in common here. So in all of these, glucose, galactose, they all end in OSE. And we're going to find out that's going to be pretty common today when we talk about our sugars, our starches, and our fibers. So they're going to end in OSE. Now, these particular ones have hexagon shapes. So you can see I'm highlighting the hexagon shape. And that's one of the things that I look for when I look at a sugar. I look for what kind of shape is the core of it. In this case, it's going to be a hexagon shape. And then the next thing I do is once I figure out the shape, I then look at the number of carbs. So in this case, each of these have 6 carbs. So let's see. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on alpha glucose. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in beta glucose, and in galactose, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in galactose. So these are sugars that are monosaccharides, and these three happen to have hexagon shapes. So let's look at another set of monosaccharides, and these you'll see that are going to look differently. Now these three still end in OSE, so we have fructose, which you may have heard of, okay, ribose, okay, and then the next one is deoxyribose. So first thing we want to notice today on these is that they have pentagon shapes instead of hexagon shapes, okay. The next thing we want to look at is the number of carbons. Now fructose does have 6 carbons, just like the other guys do. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons for fructose. Ribose is going to have 5 carbons. And then the next one is deoxyribose, and that's also going to have 5. So once I get through this, I notice that I have ribose and deoxyribose. The one thing that's different between the two, and I have arrows pointing it out, on the bottom right corner, you'll see that ribose has an OH. Remember, oxygens are red, so we have an OH on that bottom right corner, where deoxyribose does not have that oxygen. And if we look at the word deoxy, D means to take away or lost, and then oxy, oxygen, ribose. So we have a ribose without an oxygen. So if we look at their formulas, we'll see that ribose is C5H10O5 and deoxyribose is C5H10O4. All right. One other thing I want to talk about, another new term for us, is something that's interesting. So if I look at all of these are 4 monosaccharides that we just talked about: alpha glucose, beta glucose, galactose, and fructose. They all end in OSE. That's good. They all have 6 carbons. But if you look really closely, they also have the same formula. So they're all C6H12O6. So that formula doesn't always just go with glucose. It actually goes with fructose. It has the same chemical formula. Now this has a name, and it's called an isomer, or these 4 are isomers. They have the same formula, but different structures. So I want to, before we get too far, I want you to realize that's a new term for us. So we talk about isomers, and they have the same formula, but different structures. Now this is very similar to what we would call as an isotope. Now, if we remember our term isotope, that was when we had the same number of protons, but different number of neutrons. So we have the same term going off in the front there. So we have iso in both isomer and all of these things. When we have chains of atoms, they're called polymers. You might have heard polymers as plastics, but a lot of times we have chains of things, and a single one would be called a mer. So we have an isomer. Okay, different structures. Okay, so the same formula but different structures. All right, so let's look at a more complex sugar. And these are still, I would still consider these sugars. And this next one we're going to look at is called sucrose. Okay, now sucrose is what we would call table sugar. So the sugar that we have on our table, which we would use for tea or coffee. Um, when I was a kid, I don't know if people still do this, is because the cereals today have plenty of sugar in them. We used to put a little bit of sugar in our cereals, but I don't think we need to do that anymore. We certainly get way more sugar than we need to today. All right, so let's look at sucrose. Again, this is going to be a saccharide, but in this case, di. Now, if we look at that word, di means two, so I have two saccharides. So what this is going to be, it means that it has two monosaccharides. And if we take a little box around here, we can see, and if you analyze this enough, you can see that this is an alpha glucose. And on the other side, we have a fructose. So sucrose is a combination of alpha glucose and fructose, and they're bound together. And they notice that I have water there because in order to actually break this down, I need to have water available to do that. So we talked about breaking down. So how do we break that down? Well, our bodies produce something, an enzyme, which is a form of protein, and it is, in this case, they need to break it down in order to break that bond between the two. We have an enzyme called sucrase. So we have sucrose is our sugar, and our enzyme to break it down is called sucrase. And you notice that it has an ASE at the end. Just like our sugars have an OSE at the end, the enzymes have ASE at the end. And we'll see a pattern going on there. So this one is sucrose. Let's look at another disaccharide, and this one is called lactose. Now, lactose is found in milk products, and our bodies make the enzyme called lactase. Now, lactase, when we're little, when we're babies, we need lactase to break down our mother's milk. But as we grow older, we don't really need to have that enzyme anymore, so our body kind of just grows out of it. And sometimes, if you know people that are lactose intolerant, they don't make that enzyme anymore because their body doesn't really think they need it. And what happens is they're not very good at processing cheeses and milks and yogurt and other things, butter, and they have what's called lactose intolerance. And that's really can be challenging for our system because our body doesn't know what to do with these big molecules anymore. And then it causes a lot of discomfort in our digestive system. Nothing terribly major, but it is very uncomfortable. So let's look at lactose a little further. So again, it does end in OSE, just like the others. It has two monosaccharides, so let's see what they are this time. So there's our first box, and that's galactose this time, and it combines with alpha glucose. So we have that bond in the middle between a galactose and an alpha glucose, and some people don't create the enzyme called lactase. Again, we have lactose is the sugar, and the enzyme needed to break it down is called lactase. All right. So the next thing we're going to look at is starches. Now, these are going to be more complex, and these are called polysaccharides. So we talk about poly, we mean many, right? So a polysaccharide or a starch is going to be a long chain of simple molecules, or not simple, but simple sugars. So this one happens to be called amylose. Again, just like all of our others, they end in OSE. They're long chains of monosaccharides. In this case, they're long chains of alpha glucose molecules. And they need, or we need, an enzyme called amylase to break it down. So we have amylose is our starch, is our sugar, and we have amylase is our enzyme. And you can see that we just have long chains of these. Now, I couldn't even draw how many chains these are, but these are called complex carbs sometimes because we do have amylase in our system and in our bodies, and we actually produce it in our saliva. And this starts to break down these complex carbs and breaks the chain with them, and then they can be turned into glucose. Remember, I said earlier that almost everything we eat eventually can turn into glucose that we can use for energy. So this one is a starch. Let's look at another type of polysaccharide, and this one's going to be a fiber. And you'll notice again, this one is also a long chain. It is called cellulose, and we can see it's cellulose plus water, but cellulose is a tree like we would find in um, basically the bark of a tree or the wood of the tree, and we're not too good with eating wood. Okay, we don't do very good with that. So we notice that it still ends in OSE. It's long chains of monosaccharides, just like starches, and in this case, it's beta glucose. Now, this one is a little different, not much. We still would need an enzyme to break it down, and it's called cellulase. But we don't produce cellulase. That's why we don't eat trees. But there are some fibers in our diet that dietitians say that we need so that it helps our body process our food better, but we don't actually break them down. They still stay as long chains, and they do help our body get rid of all of the stuff that we have in our system. So cellulose and fibers are good for us, but not necessarily because we use them for food, because or for they're not broken down. Now you would think, well, who does break them down? Well, you might think of a termite, which eats wood, right? Well, they actually don't produce it either, but in their bodies they have a bacteria that does in fact produce cellulase, so termites can then or therefore break down the wood and get food out of it. Well, that's all we've got for today, guys. So don't forget, eat your broccoli. It's got some good carbs in there. It's got starches, it's got sugars, it's got fiber in it, and it's all good for you. So stay safe and strong, guys. And as always, have a great day.